Gamers Power Deal here. And today, we're going to talk about something a bit different, Holy Paladins, and just how absolutely insane they are in WoW Classic. So, obviously I've been making some Druid content as of late, and it's not that we're getting away from doing priest stuff, but obviously I want to branch out to the other classes as well. And I'm going to do I already did Prebis for the Druid. We're going to do Molten Corbis. We're going to do Paladin Prebis, Paladin Molten Corbis, and then, we'll get into the Blackwing Lair stuff. I may do some Shaman stuff, but I really wanted to stick with Druid, Priest, and Paladin. And somebody had asked, can you make a Paladin video? And I have been planning Paladin content for a bit, and it just kind of got me inspired to talk about Paladin because I think this class is just like juiced out of its mind. When it comes to healing Classic, I think that there's, if you were to make a tier list, right, typically Priest is always the top of that tier list, I would say, right? That's what you would pretty much see from most people who you'd poll. But I feel like realistically, that's only because Priest is so versatile, right? And that's particularly important at the start of the game, especially. And Paladins are kind of weakest at the start of the game. But once classes get gear, and obviously all classes get stronger with gear, but they don't all necessarily get stronger in the same ways, right? Paladin, I think, is like one of the classes that just absolutely completely scales with gear in like an obscene way, and they just get insanely powerful as you get towards like Nax gear, essentially. Particularly like their tier 3 is pretty incredible. A lot of the tier 3 on most of the classes, to be honest, is pretty on point, I would say, because I think Blizzard learned from itemization, right? And by the time tier 3 came around, they had a better idea of kind of like the identity that each class had taken on within Classic, at least. So some of the tier sets aren't necessarily super great. Like if you're a Shadow Priest, right, maybe you don't really like Priest tier 3, obviously, but that's kind of because just with how the game evolved, Priest had become like a mostly healing spec, right? It's kind of like the same thing for Paladin. They had become a mostly healer spec. So by the time tier 3 actually rolled around, it was pretty much tailored towards healing. And, it shows because it's really, really great healing gear, right? So I kind of wanted to just talk a bit about Paladin and how I think if we like remove the utility aspect, right, I think Paladin is sort of like the best healer in the game, I think overall, in good gear with the world buffs, this is probably the strongest healer in the game. And I actually think that it's so strong and underrated that I think people haven't even come close to unlocking like the full potential of like what this class can do in terms of like speedrunning and stuff like that. I think that honestly, you could have Paladins in like more Paladins than they take normally in speedruns, and you wouldn't necessarily see too much of a difference. I would say at least in like a normal speedrun. There's this thing that goes on in speedruns in Classic, right, where people use flasks of distilled wisdom as like mana pots, because when you use a flask of distilled wisdom, I'm going to make a video on this as well, it basically gives you the 2k mana, and you can basically just like use it and then click it off and then click another one, and it gives you another 2k mana. Like, it doesn't just increase your max mana, it actually gives you the 2k mana. So you can basically use it as like a static 2k mana mana pot, right? And it's not really intended to be used like this, obviously, right? But it's just with how it was like made, how it was added into the game. And Blizzard at the time, obviously they weren't expecting people to do this because the resource was supposed to be extremely scarce. But people would do this in like a speed run for classes like Druid, for Priests, particularly for Shamans. Shamans are big offenders of the green mana pot drinking, right? But if you didn't have green mana pots, right, and I like to imagine the game without green mana pots, because the problem is like if you keep green mana pots in the game, then the issue becomes that there's no limiting factor mana-wise, which invalidates a lot of decision making, and it invalidates a lot of the strength of some of the classes, particularly the Alliance side in general. That's a huge strength of the Alliance side, right? So being able to use green mana pots basically kind of brings the Horde much closer to Alliance, right? And in the Nax speedrun kind of competition that they did in 2019, or it wasn't the speedrun, it was like, well, it was a speedrun, but it was for the Nax opening, Onslaught was competing with, was it Progress, or it was like one of the Alliance guilds? I'm not really sure if it was who. I don't quite remember at the time, but it was basically like the Horde guild was Onslaught, and the Alliance guild was like one of those Alliance speedrunning guilds, right? And it was closer than people expected. I think Onslaught ended up wiping at one point, which kind of sealed the deal for the other guild. But it was a lot closer than people were expecting for a bit. But what people don't mention about it is that Onslaught used like 50-some or like 60-some green mana pots, like Distilled Wisdoms. And the Alliance Guild basically used like 10 or something like that, right? So, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this just speaks to the power of the Paladin, in my opinion. Right, and how much having even just like 3 or 4 Paladins, I forget how many they used exactly in that run, but they can do so much for your raid. And I think the only reason why you don't use more Paladins in the Alliance side is because the amount that they have, the small amount that they have, typically is enough to kind of handle what the raid needs healing wise, and they can supplement with everything else they need by giving the priest the green mana pots in the Alliance side, and the priest can do more throughput than the Paladin, right? So they're basically covered from every angle, right? They have a lot of throughput with the priest, and then they have just strong infinite mana batteries with the Paladins. If they couldn't use green mana pots at all, then I think maybe they run a couple more Paladins, right? So it'd be interesting to me to see a version of the game where we're not allowing Distilled Wisdom use, because I think that actually would make the comp way different. And the reason is because this class is just so broken. And we're kind of going to get into a couple things. So a couple things to keep in mind here, right? So this is a super late game Paladin. Now we can adjust it. It's pretty much max healing, I think. This ring is not max healing. You could swap it out for something else, but it has 1% crit. You could swap some things around here, obviously. But for the most part, this is max healing, right? And we also have pretty much max consumes, I would say. I don't think I missed anything, really. I think we have all the world buffs that would be what we want, right? Pretty sure we're not missing anything. I mean, we could have Divine Spirit in here, but it's not really going to do much, right? We put 4 on just to see the extra health. And you could obviously have something like War Chief's Blessing as well, if you're really trying to go crazy, but I feel like most people aren't going to use this, so I just left it out. But yeah, so we're pretty stacked here. And let's just take a look at the stats, okay? So 1,200 healing. Okay. And we're going to get back to that value in a second, right? 42% spell crit with world buffs. Absolutely insane, okay? 159 mana per second. That's an interesting value, and we're going to talk about this as well. Then crazy defensive stats as well. We're at 7.2k HP without basically anything, without rend even, right? So it could be even higher, keep in mind. And we have about close to 9k armor, which is 60% physical reduction. And keep in mind, physical damage is pretty prevalent. I mean, magical damage is definitely dangerous in a lot of these dungeons and raids and stuff like that, but physical damage is no joke, depending on what exactly you're encountering, right? So this is not a useless stat whatsoever, right? Very, very potent. But the stats kind of look insane, and then we're going to see how exactly they're applied as well, okay? So let's go into like our two, I'm not even going to go like super in depth on everything, but let's go into like the bread and butter spell, right? Which is Flash of Light. This is the one that you hear about all the time. It's like, oh, Paladins, they do a spam Flash of Light. So the base on this spell is 348 to 389, okay? And then on top of that, it costs 140 mana, okay, and a 1.5 second cast. It's basically like a flash heal, but a very neutered version, right? It doesn't do a lot of healing, but the mana cost of it is not really that bad, right? So it seems like kind of a fair trade-off. Well, the main downside of the spell for most of the game is that it just doesn't feel like it quite puts back enough mana, right? And you still use it a lot, right? It's not that you don't use it. This is the bread and butter spell of the Paladin. But you're just kind of always wishing, like, man, if I had a little bit more healing on this, it would feel really good, right? That's actually a reason why Paladins, I feel like, even though they get really bad diminishing returns from plus healing on this spell, they only get like a 40-some% coefficient. They actually do like to stack a bunch of plus healing because they basically just don't end up needing the mana once they're reasonably geared. So what that means is that if you don't need the mana, you might as well just get every last point of plus healing. And it's kind of almost the opposite problem that Priest has, right? Where on Priest, if you're using max rank Flash, you're kind of, especially when you're taking into account crits and stuff like that, you're thinking like, I'm kind of bound to overheal at some point, right? Because maybe the spell is putting back a little bit too much health. You never have that problem with this rank of Flash heal, right? Because it just doesn't do a lot to begin with. 350 basically to close to 400, right? So it's in like a 0.42 something coefficient, 0.44, something like that. So basically, you're getting 45% of the 1200 value. So let's just call it 50%, right? Well, let's actually just say it's like 500, okay? So you're getting like 500 healing from this, okay? So basically this goes up to like, 850 to 900 healing right off the rip, okay? That's not even counting any talents or anything like that. Now you have this, which increases your flashlight by 12%. Now this doesn't increase the total amount, I don't think. It increases the base value, okay? So realistically, this is adding about 30, a little bit more, right, to your flashlight. And I think it just gets added on top because I don't think this has to get put through the coefficient because it's just like an increase, right? So now we're up to like 900, 930-ish, or we'll say like 880 to like maybe 920, right, on the flashlight. Now, then we have this, right, which I think that this, I don't think it actually has to go through the coefficient because it says increases healing done by flash of light. It doesn't actually add the total to your healing value, which is what typically goes through the coefficient. So this is actually kind of insane if that is how it works, but even if it's not, it's just extra healing, right? So I think this straight adds the 83, which means that you're now going from basically 9, or what did I say? Like I said, 920 to basically like 1k, right? So now we're doing 1k flashlights. So keep in mind, this is on a non-crit, okay? If we crit, it's even higher than that, right? And we're going to go into here, and we're going to search Blessing of Light, okay? I actually should have already had this brought up, and that's the wrong thing. So this is why we bring stuff up beforehand, but it's okay. Blessing of Light. You have to mouse over it to see because there's like one where it does the range for some reason. This is it. Okay, yeah. Okay. Flash of Light spells used on target by 150. Now again, I'm pretty sure that this is just flat. Okay. So I don't think this interacts with crit or anything like that, and it doesn't interact. Like, it's just adding 115 to any flashlight that goes in the target. So when you have Blessing of Light, which you will, especially on your most important targets, right, like tanks and stuff like that, your Flash of Light is now basically like 1.1 to 1, like, like 1.1 to like 1.2k ish, okay, per heal. That's non-crit, and you have 40-some% chance to crit. And that's, so for 140 mana, okay, you're healing basically 1k plus every time, every 1.5 seconds. That is insane, okay, for 140 mana. Just absolutely insane. That's not even counting anything like this trinket effect or anything that like adds healing to the next X amount of spells or anything like that. That's just like with all your standard stuff, okay? But things get even crazier, right? Because let's go down and let's look at the mana per 5 seconds. So 159 mana per 5 seconds, okay? This is just flat. This is not like, we're not counting in mana pots, we're not counting in dark runes, nothing like that. Nothing that gives additional mana. This is just your flat mana per 5, right? And this is occurring all the time, right? Doesn't matter if you're in combat, out of combat, if you've casted, you haven't casted, you're getting this all the time. And again, what do we say? We have our, it's like 140 mana for Flash of Light, right? So we're actually getting more mana back every 5 seconds than a whole Flash of Light cast that's healing for like 1.1 to 1.2k, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? And you can cast at max 3 of these, okay, in 5 seconds, right? So you're basically getting one of the casts for free. You can think of it like that, right? 1 out of every 3 of your Flash of Light casts are just completely free, okay? Completely free, and they only cost 140 mana to begin with, okay? And how much mana do you have? You have 12k mana, okay? 12k mana, and you could configure this to have more, but this is like a conservative value of 12k mana, okay? Like, just think about that. That's absolutely ridiculous how many casts you can get off, right? But we're not done. So we come in, and we haven't even talked about the main thing that makes this class good, which is Illumination. After getting a critical effect from your Flash of Light, Holy Light, or Holy Shock, heals 100 or gives 100% chance to gain mana equal to the base cost of the spell. That is ridiculous. So basically, when you crit, it just refunds the spell's costs, unless they mention the base cost of the spell, right? But so that should pretty much always be, I believe, the same value, because you can't really I think all the spells in the game are based off your base mana cost, right? So there's not really a way to like augment this unless you were to use something that would increase the mana somehow of the spell. Like maybe if you were cursed with like the Luciferon curse, right, and you crit with Flash of Light, it would only refund you the base, not what you spent on it, stuff like that, right? But I mean, that's basically never going to be the case, right? You're always spending the 140 mana. You're always getting it back, basically. So 50% of the time, about, right, it's actually 42% or something like that, you are getting a free spell. So half the time you're getting a free spell, and then guaranteed you're getting your regen back equal to one of those spells every 3 spells, okay? So you're basically never going And this is like, keep in mind, this is if you're casting like 100% of the time, right? You're never going to be casting like literally 100% of the time because you're going to be moving between packs. There's some periods of the raid where there's just like, not as much trash than other parts, right? Like you're never having 100% uptime, right? So you have time in between these casts to basically regen some mana. There's going to be times where even when you're in combat, things aren't really taking much damage, stuff like that, right? So you are basically, it's impossible for you to go casting the spell, right? And then on top of that, you have Holy Light. Now, Holy Light costs a lot of mana, right? But you can see it heals for a metric, like, ton, right? 1600 to 1800 basically base. Okay, now this has a much better coefficient. It's like 0.84 because it's a 2.5 second cast, okay? And so you're almost getting close to 100% of this value. Let's call it like 1,000, right? Of this healing, depending on if you actually have this healing value or if things are a little bit different. You'd be getting roughly like 1,000 points of healing on the spell, right? And so that puts you up to, you know, basically 2,500, 2,800, something like that. Then on Blessing of Light, you get an extra 400 on Holy Light, okay? 400. So we're cracking like 3k heals, right? And now this spell, it does cost a bit of mana, right? But you have the flexibility to really go into like a super high HPS cast if you need to, okay? And the best part is you can alternate between the two, and that's what you're basically doing, right? Because you don't need to be casting this all the time. You don't need to be casting this most of the time. So in fact, like, you can use this to help catch up and then immediately go back to something like Flash of Light. If anybody's seen my priest leveling video, it's almost like the same dynamic of like when you're grinding on a Shadow Priest or something like that, right? And I mentioned you have the mana positive rotation and you have the mana negative rotation. And the idea is you start with the mana negative rotation, right? So you start because you want to spend mana to do more damage to kill stuff faster. And then as your mana gets lower, you dial it back and you switch to the mana positive rotation where you actually start getting mana back while killing stuff, right? And you're going to kill stuff a little bit slower, but you're going to regen your mana. And it prevents you from having to ever stop to drink, right? And this is essentially the same dynamic that's going on with the Paladin. Like, when you have really insane surpluses for your mana, you can lean into Holy Light a lot more, right? And you can kind of spend through some of that mana. And then if you are starting to go a little bit, you're 50-60%, you can dial it back, transition to pure Flash of Light spam, right? Still have an incredible heal there. And you're basically, in some cases, if you're counting your Dark Rune and pot usage, you're definitely going mana positive. And even in cases where you're not using those, if you don't have to be 100% casting Flash like all the time, then you are going to go just mana positive in general, right? Because you're going to be ticking back basically a Flash heal every 5 seconds. So, it is very easy to get your mana back. And, so this class is just absolutely ridiculous. There's no other class that can even come close to, like, the mana efficiency of this. This is why, like, whenever you see, like, the 3-mana Nixia or whatever like that, it's always with a Paladin, right? It's always because it's just a completely broken class, right? And theoretically, with green mana pots existing, right, you could do this on other classes, but it's basically cheese, right? And it's not really pragmatic or affordable for most people who don't buy gold, right? Especially with the crazy flash prices that are going on. So yeah, this class is just absolutely insane. I'm going to be making videos about it and how to play it and stuff like that. This isn't really that. This is more just highlighting how crazy this class is. If you notice, I named it THANOS. And that's because I actually do think this is like the THANOS of classic WoW. Like, if we're like power ranking this class, or if this is like an anime tier list ranking where it's like how strong the characters are, like the Paladin is in like the run tier. Like you run away from this class. Like, this is a crazy, scary healing class. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I normally don't talk about PvP in my videos, but I'll, since this is kind of more just like a glazing video for the Paladin, we'll talk about PvP a little bit here. And this class is just ridiculous in PvP, right? It can't be CC'd with Blessing of Sacrifice. It can basically get out of any like really terrible spot with Bubble and heal itself to full very easily. It has Lay on Hands, which is a very long cooldown, but is just crazy, right? It basically costs like no mana to, well, I mean, in some cases it would cost you mana, right? But a lot of cases you're going to use it in that last resort, where you're or something anyway, right? You have a cleanse. They can cleanse 3 things, which is insane in PvE as well, by the way. Insane efficiency on something like, Magmadar, or not Magmadar, sorry, Chromagus or something. Let's actually just take a look at the cleanse. By the way, we'll go in here. I think it's actually just called cleanse, right? Yeah. So, just like absolutely ridiculous button. Cleanses 3 things, right? Just can't cleanse curse, but cleanses everything else. Absolutely ridiculous. And then it still has like the crazy mana regen in PvP, keep in mind, right? Because a lot of it is based off the crits, right? And we talked about the flash of light crits, but I mean, your holy light can still crit too. So you can be refunding 660 mana, right? So even when you're casting those huge chunky holy lights that are like eating a ton of your mana supposedly, right? You're still getting basically your mana back on close to 50% of them in a world buff situation. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And the armor of this class is like insane. Like you don't want to be fighting this class as a rogue in PvP. You know, like you just don't. It's absolutely terrible. Especially when they have like a shield on, especially when they have like good late game gear on. Oh my god, like it's you're not killing this class. You know, it's like a melee class. So and that in itself is providing them with more space, right? Like if anything, like the traditional thought process, and it doesn't always turn out to be this way, right? If you've ever played Retail Arena, you know that depending on the various comps, like you have like different strategies, right? And it's not always go on the healer, but in Classic, a lot of times you can kind of pretty safely pile on the healer in most cases, right? This is not a healer that's easy to pile on unless you have like a lot of caster DPS, and even then you have to get through bubble, right? And then again, like I said, even if you try and CC it, it's not good unless you can lock it down with stuns, right? Because Blessing a Sacrifice is just absolutely insane and can get you out of pretty much anything. They have Blessing of Freedom to give their melee, like free reign when FAP's not on cooldown, right? Just absolutely ridiculous class. It sounds like I'm over exaggerating here, but this is probably the most powerful class in the game. I would say like bar none in a lot of cases, right? Like obviously it's filling a specific functional role as a healer, but it does it so well in both PvE and PvP that to deny its power is just insane. And one last thing to mention about it is Bop in this version of the game is not purgeable. And this is one of the reasons why Alliance are so dominant in like large scale PvP encounters, because you can bop a mage and they can just go wild against anything that's not caster DPS, right? But even in smaller scale skirmishes and stuff like casters, Bop goes crazy and it can't be purged, you know? So just like, yeah, an absolutely insane class. Not like that much more to say about it. It's just, it's Thanos. It's the end of all things, right? It's the peak of power scaling in this game. And if you want to have a bunch of fun and just like dominating PvE content, dominating PvP, you should really check out being a Paladin healer. Because if you invest and you get the right gear, you are an absolute terror. You're like a monstrosity. You're the unkillable Demon King. And there's not really much that people are going to be able to do to stop you, you know? So that's my rant on Paladin. Definitely my vote for best healer in the game. Again, like, Priest maybe edges it out at the start, right? Because the utility is really useful and Paladins aren't quite as powerful. But once Paladin gets rolling, once you get to like 8Q Nax, this class is just insane. Even in Blackwing Lair, you can already feel the power, you know? So, yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. More Paladin content to come soon. And I will see you guys later.